Jordan, it's been 1 year, can you believe that, since you came and sat in my studio and we had what was an extraordinary interview, got very emotional one part of it. Can you believe it's a year? And what kind of reaction did you have to that interview? Because some of the clips went so big and everyone was having a view about it. What was your reaction?
Well, I enjoyed talking to you, and I'm never that happy really when I become emotional about something that's being discussed, and sometimes for me that's a consequence of not exactly optimal health. You know, it makes me a little bit more emotionally fragile than I'd like to be, but by the same token, I wasn't unhappy with it. I do still hold to my belief that I am addressing a loss, a demoralization among young people, and maybe particularly young men, and that I don't feel that there's anything inappropriate about that. And so we touched on that, and I mean, other than that, I was very happy. I was very happy overall with the interview and with the manner in which people received it.
I was too. I had an extraordinary reaction just in the streets, you know, of London and New York, and people coming up to me, wanting to talk about it, wanting to know what I thought of you. And it made me realise just how wide your influence is and how important you are to so many people, especially, actually, young men. How do you feel about that influence and power that you have through that influence over so many young minds?
Well, I hope it's not power, you know, because power is not a good thing. You have to be a fool to want power. If it's influence, that's a good thing. If it's an invitational influence, that's a better thing. If it is the sort of influence that encourages people to stand up on their own and to help them believe that they can do that and that they should do it and that the world is a lesser place if they don't, then that's a good thing. And I do think that that's what's happening.
I interviewed Steven Pinker recently, and he'd always said for years that we've never had it so good as a planet, that statistically, whether it was poverty or health or age or whatever it may be, that on almost every recordable metric, this is the best time to ever be alive. And I asked him whether post the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis around the world, did he still feel that that held true? And he said yes, that actually despite that, this is the best time, actually, in many ways, to ever be alive. When I read your Twitter feed, which I find fascinating, exciting, challenging, combative, but often quite furious, I get a sense of somebody quite angry with the state of the world. Is that a fair reflection of your state of mind about the world? If so, why?
Am I angry? No, I wouldn't say precisely so. I'm upset at many things that I see. I think the net zero move is a travesty in 5 different dimensions. I'm absolutely appalled that the globalist utopian elitists would sacrifice the poor to save the planet, especially when there's no evidence whatsoever that they're actually effectively saving the planet. And we could take Germany as a case in point there, and I would say the UK to some degree. But I'm fundamentally optimistic. I think that human beings can solve any problem that's set in front of them. And this is also another place where I think the apocalyptic utopians have got something seriously wrong. Like, they basically take a zero-sum approach to economic analysis of the world. We have finite resources. There's only room for a certain number of people. And so, of course, that begs the question of what in your world you're going to do with all those excess people. And we have to move towards degrowth, or there's going to be an apocalypse. And I think everything about that set of presuppositions is wrong. We don't live in a zero-sum universe. The apocalyptic outcome that everyone's predicting isn't necessary. And the more fundamental truth of the matter is that if people adopt subsidiary responsibility, and we could get into what that means, and we organize our social hierarchies effectively and generously, we could make the desert bloom. We can make much out of virtually nothing. And human beings have that capacity because we can transform cognitively. And there's no reason to assume at all that we couldn't have more than enough for everyone. Now, that would mean those who want more for themselves than for other people would have to let go of that essentially power-mad desire and be willing to share and be willing to raise the poor out of poverty. And of course, doing so decreases the gap between rich and poor, and that's very annoying if you're narcissistic and rich.
What's fascinating, actually, is that whenever I've interviewed you or done your podcast, and I'm feeling it again now, I agree with so much of what you say, but that's not really the point. I believe that you come from a place of authenticity. And I think there are other people like that. Joe Rogan is another one that I watch him. I don't always agree with him, but I always feel he's authentic in a different way and to a lesser degree. But I think the point's the same. Someone like Andrew Tate, I can see why he resonates so much with young men in particular, because much of what he says, they feel fills a void in their lives where they feel oppressed as a group of people, and he gives them a sense of empowerment. So I get that. And it's interesting that I cite the three of you because Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, and many think may end up being the Democrat nominee for the presidency next year, he said this. He said, I have a very serious conversation with my eldest daughter about the chat bots on Snapchat. I really worry about the misinformation, disinformation about what's happening with our country. But I really worry about these micro cults that my kids are in. I say micro cults because I don't know if there's a better way to describe it. My son is asking me about Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, and then immediately he's talking about Joe Rogan. And I'm like, here it is, the pathway. And when I read that, I sort of laughed because I thought, what pathway do you think that is?
That statement was unconsciously comical in 4 dimensions, which is pretty remarkable achievement as far as I'm concerned. I mean, first of all, anybody who talks about misinformation and disinformation, that the misinformation and disinformation that other people are spreading, is they immediately invalidate themselves as a serious observer in my viewpoint, because they're basically arbitrary censors. I mean, it's not as if we have some stellar and completely omniscient manner of distinguishing truth from falsehood, which is why we have free speech, so we can hash things out. And if people are foolish enough to believe that there's some straightforward way of identifying the purveyors of mis and disinformation, which is what the UN insists upon now, then they are in fact identifying themselves as the prime purveyors of such falsehood, I would say. Then the micro cult comment, that's just ridiculously funny, because if you are daft enough to think that Joe Rogan is a micro cult, you live in 1995. Yes. Joe Rogan is the most powerful journalist who's ever lived by an order of magnitude. And if you don't know that, you're just not in the modern world. And young people are in the modern world, and they know that Joe Rogan isn't a micro cult, and Gavin Newsom might not know that, but that just means that he's anachronistic enough to be deluded. So that's pretty damn funny. And then the next part that's funny is that maybe if Newsom had a clue, he'd be curious about why his own children are interested in these microcults, and exactly what it is about, let's say, Tate and Rogan and I that are grouped together, even though it's a strange grouping. I mean, I'm not particularly happy to be grouped with Andrew Tate, because I think that there's some elements about what he does that are quite reprehensible, but that we could certainly talk about that. And so, you know, there should be some curiosity on Newsom's front, trying to figure out why it is that this degree of popularity exists. And then the pathway comment is also extremely comical. I tweeted out after that, it's like, well, yeah, Gavin, you better be careful. We're coming for your children there, buddy. We're going to turn your girls into women and your boys into men. And I know that's a dreadful proposition, but, well, you know, it's just so preposterous. I don't know who he thinks he is in the most fundamental sense, and that's really something crucial, since he's likely going to run for president.
Right.
And I don't know what world he thinks he lives in, but he certainly has virtually zero curiosity. You know, and I should point out as well, Piers, I have invited many Democrats onto my podcast. And one has agreed, and that's going to be broadcast soon. But for years I've worked, and I have very many contacts with Democrats, by the way. They're all terrified to come on my podcast. They won't talk to me. And so if it is a microcult, at least half the reason for that is that the damn useful idiots on the progressive side, let's say, are too terrified of the woke mob to come out and actually have a conversation.